Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this program by Radboud Reflects on Xi Jinping's China. My name is Chile Tempels. I'm a lecturer in political theory and program manager at Radboud Reflects. I'll be your host this evening. And tonight we'll indeed be talking about Xi Jinping's China, as the title already mentioned. For Xi Jinping is now president of China for almost 10 years and has put China on the map as a superpower. Journalists are talking about an economic, political, cultural revolution. And that has been set in motion under his auspices. So the question is, how revolutionary is are these changes? How revolutionary is his leadership? And what ideas and ideology motivates Xi? That's what we'll be talking about this evening. And how does his ideology, and what does it entail, how does it fit within China's historical context? We're going to be talking about that with Florian Schneider. Initially, philosopher Dasha During would also be present during the evening, but she sadly couldn't make it. Nevertheless, we're very happy that Florian is here. He will be talking, he's from Leiden University, and he will be talking about Xi's rise to power, his ideology and his politics, and as well about the celebrity status that now seems to be surrounding his persona. After the lecture, I will engage in a conversation with him, and afterwards there's also ample questions from you as the audience. So, without further ado, I give the floor to Florian Schneider.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's always fun to be announced as a China expert. As you'll see in a moment, the complexities that we're going to be talking about are so humongous that really there isn't anyone who can claim to be an expert on China, including probably Xi Jinping himself. And that's something that China scholars like to remind others of as well. Even the Chinese Communist Party doesn't understand how everything works in China. That's what makes things so exciting and interesting. So today I want to talk with you a bit about Xi Jinping, about his power, how we should make sense of his role in Chinese politics. And I want to especially position that conversation in respect to some of the reporting that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, that you've seen in the news, in which Xi Jinping gets a particular kind of narrative. We get a very specific kind of representation of what Xi is all about, and I would make the case that that's not a very accurate representation. As is often the case with the news, our journalist colleagues try their best, and often they do a good job, but in this case, we're trying to delve a little bit deeper. And so I'm going to talk a bit about how Xi Jinping's power often gets represented around him as a person, as him either as the new emperor, as extending the rationale and the logic of imperial China, or in a way that suggests that he is the new Mao. So this is a particularly wonderful cover because it also puts him in the Mao suit. It uses the iconography, if you're into art history, right? The visual symbolism of the Mao era in order to suggest that there's a direct continuity here, and he is essentially the new Mao. And this is something that you also hear quite a bit in scholarship, not as much as in journalism, but very much there's a concern of whether or not the China we're witnessing now under Xi Jinping might be much closer to Cultural Revolution era China than it is to the predecessor administrations, Hu Jintao and Jiabao before Xi, and before that, of course, Jiang Zemin. So is there maybe a rupture in 2012, 2013 or so, where Xi comes onto the stage and he's turning China back towards Maoist times? And I don't think that's necessarily accurate, but one of the reasons why it is such a popular understanding and why it has such legs is because, of course, Xi Jinping has, in fact, done certain things in his politics that center power more around him. One is that he has abolished the term limits for presidency and for his leadership of the Communist Party, so it was becoming tradition, as much as something can be tradition over the course of 40 years. It has become tradition that leaders would step down after 2 terms, after 10 years. And all other leaders had done that after Mao. But Xi Jinping has now abolished this practice. And so we see a reversal of what looked like a more institutionalized linear progression through Chinese party politics. And then we have this understanding that Xi Jinping has been grabbing power, has been amassing power. This is insofar true that he's been taking on various kinds of core offices, for example, running the cyber administration himself. He's obviously the chief commander of the military forces. He's the head of the party, he's the head of the state. In many cases, this is true for all previous presidents of China, but Xi Jinping seems to have taken on additional tasks, streamlined the administration further. And one thing that people tend to have on their mind when they think about power is the anti-corruption campaigns that he has launched in 2012, 13, and they are still ongoing. And this is him swatting flies, so taking care of the low-level cadres and also beating back the tigers, which are the high-level cadres. So the idea is that the anti-corruption campaign catches everyone. And it's him literally with the brush cleaning up as a symbolism here of how Xi Jinping is at the center of this. And many people feel that this anti-corruption campaign was really just a way for Xi Jinping to amass even more power, to get rid of his opposition, and to reward himself and his cronies and put them into power. That is not entirely accurate. It's not fully wrong either, because a lot of people got caught up in this anti-corruption campaign who weren't allies of Xi. But we're talking about thousands of cadres who've been caught up in corruption scandals, and probably something like 75% or so at the lower levels, which are not a danger to Xi Jinping. So there's something else going on of why this corruption campaign was launched, why it took so long and still ongoing, and why it is so important. In fact, I was in China in 2017 talking to people about this, and it was quite clear that especially working class folks felt that this was a very good campaign, and they were big fans of Xi Jinping because they felt that corruption was such a problem in the party, and finally someone was doing something about it. So that's something to keep in mind here as well. But one thing we see with Xi Jinping that is relatively new is the strong focus on ideology, and specifically ideology is attached to him. So Xi Jinping thought, this is... many of you probably won't read Chinese. Is this a button? Yeah, so you have the wonderful language play here. Xue means to study, and this is the character for Xi Jinping. But Xi also can be written slightly differently, meaning to learn, to study. So Xue Xi means both to study and to study Xi at the same time. And that is, you're supposed to study Xi Jinping thought, right? And all the Communist Party cadres are instructed to do so. And in more popular discourses, it's also suggested that Xi Jinping thought is the guiding ideology for the party in the future. You get this in all the books that were published about it. If you're in China and you're in any kind of hotel that is a more officious hotel, then you'll definitely have a book like this on your nightstand, much like in other hotels you might have the Bible. So you get these in all languages now, and that's Xi Jinping thought for you, the thoughts of the great leader, right? And then you even have an app which cadres are supposed to use in order to train themselves in Xi Jinping thought. It's kind of a gamified setup. You get points, and people who are cadres are instructed to use it also to get their bonuses and to assure their promotions in the future and so on. So it's kind of demanded that you learn Xi Jinping thought through this app. The app can be gamed, by the way. A lot of people just have it playing in the background with videos of Xi Jinping talking while they do other things just to get the points, which already tells you something about how ideology and its relationship to cadres in the public works. Often enough, it's more of a lip service than it is actually internal the ideas themselves. Nevertheless, we have this app, and a lot of the media at the time when it came out, I think it was 2014, called it the Little Red app in relation to, in reference to the Little Red book. That Mao famously had published, and that had all the Mao quotes in it, and that all the Red Guards were carrying around, and now everyone was carrying around the app. So you can see there's a lot of parallels, and it makes sense that people would talk about this in the context of Mao, but as I will try to persuade you today, it's not the whole story. That's not enough for us to understand what's going on in China at the moment and what role Xi Jinping plays. So before we continue with what I would think is a better explanation, we should talk about the explanation that is often used to understand what is Xi Jinping's role today, and that is the idea of a cult of personality. So you see a lot of people talking about Xi as a leader or a leader cult having developed around him. I have to move the microphone a little bit because I don't have a monitor, so I have to read from the screen as you're never supposed to. I apologize. So a leader cult is an established system of veneration of a political leader to which all members of society are expected to subscribe, a system that is omnipresent and ubiquitous, and one that is expected to persist indefinitely. It is thus a deliberately constructed and managed mechanism which aims at the integration of the political system around the leader's persona. And this is Arfon Riese, a Russian scholar who has made this case for some of the most famous cases which come from Russia, which are, of course, Lenin, Stalin. Right? Those are the classic personality cults. We also have the personality cults that have governed North Korea and, of course, Germany, right? Hitler, famously famous example of personality cult. So the argument here, or not here, not Afon's argument, but the argument, a lot of people who now compare Xi to Mao, is that something very similar is happening in China today as happened in these particular moments in history. I'm not entirely sure that's true. So we do still see personality cults today. This is North Korea not too long ago, where these kind of venerations are enacted and performed on almost like on a stage, where everyone has to cry together. We don't know what people are actually thinking and what's going on behind the scenes, right? But this is what we're getting presented as part of the propaganda and the public sphere. And one thing that is important to recall in these contexts is that personality cults are almost always totalitarian. They're supposed to infuse all parts of society. There's no room left outside of it. And while Xi Jinping is very important in China, he might not be as important as Mao Zedong, who was the literal red sun, or figuratively speaking, the red sun. But people took this literally, that he was almost godlike. Right? It was almost a religious-like veneration of Mao Zedong at the time. So a couple of features are important when we talk about personality cults, and I'm going to try and tick the box on each of these as we move on. One is ideology. I've already mentioned it. The way that the Communist Party has treated ideology over time has always been quite central to its politics, much more so than in many other political contexts in other countries. But under Xi, this seems to have gotten another push. And so the question is, are we looking at a almost religious-like use of ideology? The other important feature is what's called patrimonial governance, so the idea around a central figure who is the leader. And as we'll see in a moment, that is more of an ambiguous point to tick, because yes, Xi Jinping plays an important role in politics, but there's much more going on. I'll say a little bit more about network politics in a moment, which I think are a better explanation of how the CCP works today, especially in the way that institutionalization works, because it's not necessarily the case that Xi Jinping as a figure is being institutionalized, but that he's becoming a symbol, while other forms of institutionalization are taking place in the background, often very complex governance mechanisms that don't involve him. Then we have the question of how the public and the followers of the leader relate to that leader. And that has a great deal to do with mediation, with culture, with political communication. But as we'll see in a moment also, we are living in a world where political communication now is filtered through digital systems, and that changes the game significantly compared to the straight-up propaganda and propaganda posters and propaganda theater and so on that was doable in the 60s and 70s, maybe even still doable all the way through to the invention and introduction of the internet, but has now become not necessarily obsolete, but part of a hybrid media ecology in which many, many different things are going on with too many actors to control necessarily from one perspective. That would be the perspective of the party. Now, we have other examples from Chinese leaders who are also quite central to Chinese politics, which is sometimes somewhat overlooked. Clearly, Deng Xiaoping was not venerated the same way as Mao was, but he was absolutely crucial to the reform era, and he is still now a symbol that is on propaganda posters to illustrate this move towards an open society, or at least open economy. And so he is very much a figure that is, especially by those who disliked Mao in China, the people who were at the receiving end of the Cultural Revolution, he is often venerated as a hero juxtaposed to Mao. And then we have more recent leaders, Jiang Zemin, not particularly favored by cult-like veneration during his time in office, but afterwards becoming almost a satirical hero. It's always a bit difficult to judge by folks who call him a toad and call themselves toad worshippers because of the way he looks, right? They associate him with a toad. And it is now a term of endearment to call him a toad and be a toad worshipper. And people are tweeting in Chinese social media at certain times to add +1s, as you can also see on this birthday cake here, which is to donate 1 second of your life to Jiang Zemin, so that he will have that 1 extra second. If everyone does that, he'll live longer. That's the idea. Let's make sure that Jiang Zemin is around longer. So you have these very strange practices around political leaders, some of which are humorous, right? Some of them are more serious. And I think that is a much more useful entryway into understanding how people also relate to Xi Jinping. You see, I've actually omitted a leadership generation here. I've not spoken about Hu Jintao or Wen Jiabao. It's interesting that Wen Jiabao was also frequently referred to as Uncle Wen or even Grandpa Wen. So there were different ways to familiarize this particular leader, the prime minister at the time, with people and to suggest a family relationship. And I'm bringing this up here because this is also what's happening with Xi Jinping and his wife, Peng Liyuan, who are then referred as Mama Peng and Daddy Xi, I suppose. So this is what this comic here shows in a kind of cutesy way, but also suggesting this familiarity. And that is a quite common strategy for reducing the distance between leaders and citizens. So the way I think is actually more useful to think about this than cult of personality and this kind of totalitarian framework is to compare Xi to celebrities and to talk about him in a context of celebrity politics. So by celebrity, I mean, using Chris Rojak here, a famous scholar of celebrity, the attribution of glamorous or notorious status to an individual within the public sphere, and that notoriety or that glamour can be based on a number of things and can be based on actual skills or achievement. That's called that's called achieved celebrity, but you also get attributed celebrity where people are simply famous because they're famous, and we know, of course, many, many examples like that where people don't have skill. Xi Jinping is, of course, one of those cases where someone has achievements to their belt, right, and is venerated for that. Similar examples would be sports stars, for example, or particular musicians and so on. So in a sense, we can maybe use the framework of celebrity to ask, what does that have to do with politics? How are politicians using their celebrity status or constructing their celebrity status in order to achieve certain ends? And a lot of that has to do with the relationship that gets into place when people think that they know someone from TV and from mediation, even though they don't. And that's called a parasocial relationship. And I've already given you an example suggesting that a leader is the mom or dad of the country or is your grandpa, does exactly that. Right? It creates this sense of an actual social relationship where there is none. And that's a very clever propaganda trick. Maybe we shouldn't call it propaganda. By the way, the word propaganda in China, not a bad word at all, 宣传. It just means to propagate, to announce something. But in most English language and foreign language context, propaganda has a bad rep because it sounds like manipulation. Maybe the better word to use is PR, because also the Communist Party has redesigned its propaganda to call its propaganda department PR department, specifically to suggest it's actually not doing much different from other political systems that are also announcing things. It's not that simple. Maybe in the discussion we can talk about some of the manipulation that goes on behind the scenes. But this is one of those manipulations that also, let's face it, PR firms also use in order to create connections with people and suggest that you should be buying more stuff. Only here you're supposed to be buying political ideology, right? And there's reasons why the Communist Party has shifted somewhat its focus in propaganda and ideology around the time that Xi Jinping comes into office. There's numerous reasons, but one of the templates that at the time was already in play was by another Chinese politician who famously faltered and is now in prison, and that's Bo Xilai, the former head of Chongqing. And he was someone who at the time was, in contrast to all of these other black-suited men who all look the same, no one ever smiles, and everyone's just representing the people, and it's all the same. He was someone who had, flair and charisma. And he was talking in a normal language to people. He was also singing Communist Party songs and Mao-era songs with people in the streets and initiating campaigns like that. He was very, very popular in Chongqing. Turned out to be a complete crook and corrupt, and now he's gone. But also, Xi Jinping must have been quite happy to see him gone because he was a very serious competitor for a future political position. And so he's out of the picture, but the Communist Party has learned a great deal about having had this one particular charismatic person suddenly show up and be very good at his job, asking what do we need to do in order to put the Communist Party on sounder contemporary footing for the 21st century, and a reasonable answer would be to capitalize on precisely what Bo Xilai had been doing, but now, around someone who is an actual reliable leader for the party, and that would be Xi Jinping. So you see Xi Jinping's celebrity status and actually working very differently than Mao's cult status, because Mao, the idea was he's the sun, he's distant, he's far away, he shines on everything. Xi Jinping is close, he's like you and me, he likes the stuff that we also like, right? He likes basketball, he loves football, he plays soccer and is fun that way. He goes to a dumpling restaurant and eats dumplings with the regular Joe, spelled differently, I suppose, in Chinese, and being seen with the average folks out there. And so that's kind of reducing the distance between the leader and the public. Again, artificially, this is not real social relations, it's parasocial relations, but they are designed and constructed not just by Xi himself as a person, but by the party and the propaganda apparatus to achieve certain things. So why is this happening? There's a couple of reasons, but I think a lot has to do with anxieties that are permeating Chinese society at this particular moment in time, or in this last decade. Anxieties that happen at the personal level and that make citizens susceptible or even wishful for a leader they can relate to in this way. So that includes how tough it is to live in China and make a living in China in these days, especially for a young person. You're essentially screwed because there's not going to be enough jobs, and you're going to have a very, very rough elbows out, upways road ahead of you. Getting all the things that people think are relevant in order for you to be a proper adult person. Like obviously you have to be married by 30 and have a kid. You have to have minimally one. Now you can have more. You have to have a house, you have to have a car, otherwise you're not a real person. And so there's people who don't live that life and who switch themselves out of it. But for the majority of people in China, this is kind of the ideal. And it creates a great deal of anxiety because not everyone can have that. So that is becoming a real problem. And then there's more broader social anxieties, which the Communist Party has to worry about, anxieties about social inequalities, injustices. One of the major concerns for the party is to assure social stability. And that's sort of a key word. Everything centers around social stability. So any idea that something might become unstable, people might be unhappy, that becomes a problem. And then there's the idea of achieving great power status. Some in China would say China already has done that, but then to assure that great power status, to become a superpower, essentially. That is on many people's minds, especially because of the so-called century of humiliation that preceded the Mao era, where the impression was, the West has been keeping us down, and we've been semi-colonized, and all these imperialists have been keeping us in the shade, and now it's our time in the sun. And so there's a lot of bottom-up grassroots nationalism that is creating also, again, anxieties of what the future of China should be, and a leader who can achieve that and who can deliver that, that seems like a promising way to assure party rule. Then there's another template, and again, it has to do with this idea of great power status. What do great powers need to have? Well, they need to have proper statesmen at their helm. And at the time that Xi was coming into power, the template, and probably still to this day, I would say, is Barack Obama, because of the way that his PR worked. I mean, he was just a master, and still is, at this sort of stuff. And I mean, you see this in the way that he went to comedy shows and was able to laugh at himself. Xi Jinping doesn't do that. Xi Jinping is not laughing about himself. He doesn't enjoy it when other people laugh about him. If you characterize him as Winnie the Pooh, you get censored. But Barack Obama was doing that. But one thing that the Communist Party is definitely trying to emulate is the idea of the first couple, and having this leader with the wife to go with it, right? The first lady. I could talk for another hour about the politics of gender behind first ladies. It's an intriguing and deeply problematic issue. I don't know if you know who the husband of Angela Merkel is. I don't, right? But we don't talk about the first man. Granted, she wasn't the president. But still, the equivalency doesn't work. But somehow we need to have a first lady. And so the fact that Peng Liyuan, the first lady in China, is so representable, that seems like we've arrived at the table of great power politics, and we're just like America. And it's almost always China-America comparisons, also from within China. That's the big template, so the frenemy, right? On the one hand, admired, everyone wants to be like the US, but also it's the evil imperialists at the same time. And that creates a very interesting dynamic in terms of how a lot of Chinese politicians are modeling their politics on America, while also at the same time trying to undermine American politics and reject them. A lot of this then has to do with the way that our societies today are built around media and have become spectacular. And I say nowadays, because actually the person who wrote about this first wrote about it in the 60s, and that's Guy Debord, who wrote The Society of the Spectacle. If you want to pick it up, it's a very interesting Marxist, post-Marxist analysis of that moment in French history. But it very much holds, because he was writing this. The spectacle is a social relation between people that is mediated by an accumulation of images that serve to alienate us from a genuinely lived life. The image is thus a historical mutation of the form of commodity fetishism. And what he was trying to get at was very similar to the Frankfurt School, this idea that with the constant commodification of the cultural industries, we are all led to believe in conflicts that are not real, like whether some celebrity slaps another celebrity at some reward show. Who cares, right? But it dominates the news for weeks and everyone talks about nothing else. That's a false conflict. No, at least, in the Marxist understanding of this. So the real conflict should be about social conflicts, and we're not talking about those. And so the commodity fetishism glosses over this. It's telling how readily available then the fetishism of images, of symbols is to any leader, whether in an authoritarian society or a democratic one, in order to create relationships and impressions that gloss over deeper underlying issues. And so the Communist Party is also very readily there to capitalize on the idea of this fandom practices around its leader in order to distract from maybe more underlying broader issues and inspire loyalty and unity. So what then about the followers? One of the things that critics of Xi Jinping have been saying is that the followers of Xi, or the followers, that's an open question, are they actually followers of Xi, or are they followers of Chinese nationalism? We can maybe unpack that in a moment, but that the followers are much like Red Guards. They're the new Red Guards because they're so aggressively in favor of their symbol of veneration, and they reject everyone else, and they treat everyone else who is not on board with them as traitors. And so that becomes then analogous to the Red Guards. And you see this with the nationalist movements. These are nationalist protests in London around the time that the Hong Kong protests were taking place, 2019, and these were counter-protests, saying, people who are supporting Hong Kong and Hong Kong independence are splitting China. So there were a lot of very angry, particularly young people, students abroad, who were going into the streets and demonstrating for China. And we've seen this many times also during the 2008 Olympics, during any kind of moment where there's a lot of criticism of China in Europe or America, then you get these counter-protests. And in most recent years, you have very, very strong nationalist sentiments, especially also then in the wake of the COVID pandemic. Maybe we get a chance to talk a little bit more about that later. And some of these tactics that the nationalists use are familiar from previous populist aggressive mobilizations, including the Red Guards. So the bullying, the informing on other people, that seems similar, but there's something that has shifted with the use of technology, particularly the way that people now identify others, look them up. China, this is called the human flesh search engine, right? You're trying to find out who are your enemies and then identify them and dox them, right? And also make sure that they face consequences in their real lives, like getting fired because they had an Instagram photo somewhere where they waved a Taiwanese flag. No go, right? You're done. You don't even have to come to work anymore because someone has informed on you. This is the sort of stuff that actually does happen in China, and that creates a spiral of silence around a lot of political issues where people are generally reluctant to speak out on issues where the radical nationalists might come out of the woodwork and hunt you down. So that makes it seem quite plausible that we're talking about the contemporary equivalent of Red Guards, as here's another example from the start of the COVID pandemic. The diary that an author from Wuhan wrote about the Wuhan Lockdown, and that is also widely available in various translations, and that was reviled in China as an effort to undermine China and to speak to foreign audiences only and misrepresent China and so on. And so she was metaphorically speaking, slaughtered online, and by a host of different actors, including official actors. So you have indeed the CCP paid commentators and so on agitating against this particular woman, Fang Fang. But you also have popular grassroots sentiment either getting on board or sometimes driving these discussions in a way that then also tries to out her as a traitor and malign her. Here's another example of how fandom politics can get out of hand, and why I tend to talk about the kind of people we're now looking at more as fans than as Red Guards. Because as we'll see, fandom practices can be quite radical around the world, in China certainly. This is a case from China, just 2020, so very recent. Xiao Zhan, an actor who appeared famously in a TV drama called The Untamed, where two men are fighting demons and ghosts. And they have a maybe not so subtle homoerotic relationship in this drama series, which made it a cult classic. LGBT plus issues are still very much a taboo in much of China, certainly in politics. The CCP has just again banned anything that might present gay content on television. So that is a big no-no. So trying to get by under the radar with LGBT themes is a tricky process for cultural producers, and that's also why it created so much buzz among a lot of audiences who like this sort of content. And what happened then is quite interesting. There's numerous huge fan groups for Xiao Zhan, for this particular actor. And one group included people who are creating their own fan art and their own fandom fandom fiction, which they put on a foreign website called Archive of Our Own, in which they were writing gay stories for this actor, Xiaozhan. And then the other group of fans was so offended by the fact that their favorite actor, was presented as gay, that they went all the way to the Communist Party and said, you need to shut this down. So from a grassroots perspective, they were intervening and were battling each other with these other groups until the Communist Party and the censorship apparatus indeed blocked Archive of Our Own online. And so now the fan fiction writers were extremely upset because their favorite hangout and the place that they were doing for their livelihood or for fun was blocked and was no longer available to them. So they lashed back out and started to boycott Xiaozhan and called for a boycott of the actor and everything he was related with, all the way to Estée Lauder and whatever companies were involved with sponsoring him. And so it became a mudfest, right? Just an absolute disaster. There's no good folks in the story. There's no heroes, right? Everyone was essentially being an asshole, right? And slugging mud at each other. And so this is the sort of thing that happens with fandom communities when they start to struggle over the meaning of the object of their fandom. And so this is something that you also see elsewhere. When Star Wars fans or Star Trek fans in the US get really upset because the most recent movie wasn't what they expected, or the Game of Thrones fans feel that the series didn't end properly, and sent death threats to the people who made the series. You wonder what is happening, and this is also happening in China. So on the one hand, a lot of this informs Chinese Communist Party decisions of how to regulate discussions, online discussions, and fandom and celebrity. But it also means that there's something the Communist Party feels it might want to cash in on, because idols in China are such an important part of public discourse that either getting idols on board with the CCP narrative or creating your own is an attractive way to do propaganda, particularly when you're trying to reach young people. But the risk, of course, is that these people, as Henry Jenkins famously pointed out, they're not in line with the culture you're creating for them top down. Right? For something like Star Trek, sure, there's someone who created the cultural context, but then people take it and they run with it and they start writing, again, maybe gay fan fiction about Spock and Kirk, and that's maybe not in the intended, original version, but it doesn't matter because people do whatever they want with this stuff because it's now it's theirs, right? And so if you turn the Chinese nation and the repertoire of history and national culture into a resource for fandom practice, which is what I would argue is happening, and has happened in China, then people will take those resources and again do with it whatever they want. And that means that you don't have it under control anymore. In fact, you might actually be the subject of contempt if you're not living up to the standards you yourself kind of signaled might be important. And that's why Xi Jinping has to maybe sometimes worry. So I want to just briefly give you a couple of impressions here towards the end of how I would make sense of CCP politics today, moving away a little bit from just the person of Xi Jinping. Because actually what we're seeing in China is a form of very advanced networked politics and the way that power gets used in networks. And maybe that's actually not that new, but it has come to the fore, especially now that technology also makes different kinds of politics possible. My colleague at King's College in London has pointed this out, Kerry Brown. He says the party under Xi is finally the network of networks, the only entity that lifts China outside the highly tribal, almost nodal social structure. And what I like to cite in this context is another colleague, Manuel Castells, who wrote about networks and network politics, and he made the case that it's probably not so wise to look at the state and society and maybe the market as these unified actors somehow. That's not how our societies work. Something like the state is also its own society and has all these different networks, and it connects with other networks in complex ways, which is what you see here. So maybe, I don't know, maybe this is the state in blue, and this is the party, and this is societal actors or so on. But if you zoom in on any kind of organization or agency, maybe some ministry or so on, then that has also departments and groups inside it, which are nodes in networks of their own. And if you go close enough, you realize, as we always should as good, anthropologically minded people, it's people, right? It's folks at the bottom. And they are in network relationships with each other. And power in these contexts works in two important ways. One is that individuals can sometimes switch certain people into and out of their network. That's a powerful position to be in. If you can create networks or shut other people down, and that's called switching power. And the other kind of power is to infuse an existing network with particular values and with particular discourses and ideas, and that's called programming power. And the Communist Party, even though it doesn't use this language, right? I don't know if they would recognize what I'm saying here, it's a description of what they're essentially doing. I would say the Communist Party has understood this principle for a long time and is positioning itself and its own cadres and institutions in crucial places around the network in order to inform how politics work more broadly. So some people then talk about these networks in the context of factions. That can be useful. There are some factions in Chinese politics, but I'm not always sure this is the best lens from which to understand that, what is going on in Chinese politics, because it's usually and very often Hong Kong authors who write about the factions, and I sometimes have the suspicion it's because it's exciting, right? It seems like the sort of thing that happens at court, right, and in imperial courts behind the scenes. Sometimes there's truth to this, and there are groups around, for example, the Communist Youth League or so on, that then become a faction. But more often than not, first of all, the Communist Party as a whole is an organizing principle that everyone tends to adhere to. And within that, you tend to have all sorts of moving interest groups that don't necessarily narrow down to individual factions as easily. And we've recently seen some research that looks at network structures of Communist Party cadres, which is absolutely fascinating. And one of the studies in 2016 found that one of the things that actually brings people together in Chinese Communist Party politics isn't so much what folks used to think, which is provincial networks where people came from as they went through the party, or their university networks where they studied, but is actually the co-worker relations that they experienced as they went through their careers. That seems to be one of the major factors that explains why people are loyal to other people and create sort of patronage client relationships with certain people and construct these networks inside the Communist Party. So really what the Communist Party is then doing is constructing a network in which different elites are switched on or switched off. That certainly includes political elites, it includes the military, which has had waxing and waning levels of power throughout time, but it also includes urban elites, particularly the more urban rich, and people who are increasingly switched into innovation and digital technology and are at the forefront of innovating how society works. If you go to China now, you cannot get by without WeChat, right? You do need a mobile phone, you need the kind of apps that allow you to do pretty much anything digitally now. So if you're the person who's programming these apps and is creating the standards and the defaults, that's very powerful. So you have these different elites who have expectations and who need to be brought together under the Communist Party, while the party feels it needs to legitimate itself, has to justify itself to the public. And this is very Max Weber, right, German sociologist, the idea that pretty much any political system needs to have the support of those who are governed, otherwise it won't work. That's true even in authoritarian, even in totalitarian systems. You cannot govern continuously against the public. That's not going to work. And in the Chinese case, that's also why I keep reminding folks not to treat the Chinese system as a totalitarian system. It's not. It's an authoritarian system, but it relies on collaboration and on people joining the efforts. And so the Communist Party is constantly trying to legitimate itself. It does that through various kinds of ideology. I'm looking at the clock, maybe another 5 minutes, to just briefly highlight for you that there isn't one coherent ideology, as much as the Communist Party tries to construct one and portray itself as being the arbiter of one single ideology. In reality, there's a number of different themes and discourses that float around Chinese politics. One is certainly pre-modern thought, all sorts of traditions. Frequently you see in the news that is Confucianism and how Confucian China is today. That's only partially true, and Xi Jinping keeps citing Confucian classics. That doesn't make him Confucian. It's kind of a cherry-picking exercise, and there's other traditions as well, like Taoism, Buddhism, and various, like legalism, various pre-modern philosophies that the Communist Party uses strategically in certain moments in order to signal to the audience that, yes, it's aware of all these important traditions. And there are many people in China who care a great deal about these pre-modern traditions. Then there is, of course, Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought at the core of the Communist Party ideology. This is still very much important to this day, also in the way that the Communist Party designs its own propaganda. One of the core features more recently is the so-called 12 core socialist values. Here they are. So you can see they are designed around, on one hand, the national level, prosperity, democracy, civility, and harmony. Then there's 4 at the societal level: freedom, equality, justice, and rule of law. And at the citizen level, you have patriotism, dedication, integrity, and friendship. And as you can probably already guess, things like democracy means something slightly different in the Chinese context than you might think. But also, they often mean something different for citizens than they mean for the Chinese Communist Party. This is a photo I took outside of a high school in Shanghai, where the high school, a state organization, right, apparently had people, I don't know who, paint pictures of each of these socialist core values outside, interpreting them, right? So that's also, it's an official version, but at the local level. So someone decided that 自由, freedom, was this, it's sale time, you can go shopping, that's freedom. It's an interesting interpretation of freedom, not entirely inaccurate if you consider how people in China often treat freedom and what they care about. Then there's a whole strand of ideology on the left, and I should point out that the right and the left, right, in terms of the political spectrum, are reversed in China. So left is conservative because it's the Communist Party's status quo. And orthodoxy, and the right is usually market-oriented, democracy-oriented liberalism, and is more of the progressive kind of push. And I'm simplifying because there's much in between that, of course, but there's a new left, which is harking back to more Maoist times, socialist times, the core tenets of communism, and is bizarrely quite enamored with the far right in other countries. For example, some of these new left folks are big fans of Trump. And the far right in America then also quotes the new left, quoting people on the far right, quoting people on the new left, back and forth. And you see this, for example, on Fox TV, Fox News, where people from the new left are cited with very similar stories about how the cultural progressives and those urban elites and so on are destroying culture and destroying everything. Classic stories, of course. Then there's a whole range of foreign ideologies that play a role in China to this day, particularly when it comes to explaining, justifying authoritarianism, coming up with neo-authoritarianism, certain kinds of conservatism, but also on the liberal side, right? There's plenty of people who are supporters of democratic politics, constitutionalism, and so on, which are not natively, if you want to call it that, natively Chinese, which are very popular, especially in academic circles. And then there's consumerism, not something we usually consider an ideology, but if you consider how much people, pray at the altar of mammoth, what do you call this? So a lot of people are building their life around the ideology of conspicuous consumption and signaling their status that way. And then there's the various nationalisms that I mentioned earlier. Absolutely exciting for me as a scholar of nationalism to see is how something that might legitimately be said to have started, among other places, in France, gets translated to other contexts, and how important this template of the French Revolution, or this is the later French Revolution, but this image of liberty leading the people gets adopted in Chinese-speaking contexts. So on the left, you have an official poster from the Chinese Academy of Arts designed by a volunteer, but really in the service of CCP propaganda, with exactly the same iconography, but fighting the virus. And on the right, you have Hong Kong protesters creating protest art, where again, exactly the same story. And this is why also one of my colleagues and I keep making the point that what has been happening in Hong Kong is the emergence of a Hong Kong nationalism. Hugely unpopular thing to say in Chinese circles, because how can people in Hong Kong have a nationalism other than Chinese nationalism? But de facto, I think that's what happens with a lot of younger folks who are now creating their identity around a certain sense of Hong Kongness. And it's interesting that they're using the exact same grammar, the exact same visual elements for nationalism. I'm almost out of time. I just wanted to point out that a lot of folks think maybe nationalism actually doesn't matter that much in China because Xi Jinping and his colleagues, they're impervious to public opinion. Why would they care, right? They're autocrats. And then there's some people who say, no, actually, they do care, but they care in the sense that they can manipulate nationalism on the stages of international relations and pretend that they're constrained at home by those, vapid nationalists who are always constantly angry. And what are they supposed to do in international negotiations? You have to meet us in the middle, Japan, right, or America. Otherwise, people at home will tear us apart. And that's a very rationalist choice way of thinking about political agency. I don't subscribe to this. I think actually Chinese politicians are Chinese too. Many of them simply have drank their own Kool-Aid. They believe in the same things. They've grown up with the same stories, and they're often also nationalists. Xi Jinping is also a nationalist. And that's also why it makes them susceptible to particular kinds of criticism, where people take the nationalism and revamp it and rework it, as has happened in 2020 when people from Thailand, Hong Kong, and Taiwan were attacking Chinese nationalists who attacked them. And again, we can talk about that later if you like. The internet is full of such wonderful, intriguing stories. So let me just conclude by saying that Xi Jinping has ticked the boxes, or his administration has ticked the boxes on pretty much all forms of ideology in order to create a nationalism that works for essentially everyone. It's a supermarket of ideology. And you see this in the propaganda art as well, which combines wonderfully here the iconography of Republican-era aesthetics, sort of Shanghai in the 20s, or even slightly before that, Buddhist ideas, nationalism, contemporary slogans, as you see at the bottom, Confucian ideals like Da De, great virtue. So all kind of coming together in propaganda so that everyone can pick what they want. And at the end of the day, I don't think that the comparison with Mao helps us understand any of these things, because Xi Jinping isn't Mao. Right? He's Xi Jinping, and he's doing something else together with the party. And that's why I want to conclude also again with Kerry Brown saying this about his role. Looking solely at Xi as a political figure, wondering at his power and its reach, means being seduced by the symptoms of a system, rather than truly understanding the underlying causes. Xi has only ever spoken in a context where he is within, working for a party of the party, its servant, if you like. And without an understanding of that institutional context, his power makes no sense. So I'll leave you with that thought as we move into our discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, thank you, Florian, for your wonderful lecture. I think there's plenty of things we can dig into. So let's just dive right in, I would say.
Sure, yeah.
So maybe just to start off with the thing you ended with. So we talked about Xi, we talked about the Chinese Communist Party. I was just wondering, to what extent is there room for Xi's personal views within the party?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the fact that he has placed himself at such central positions within that network means that he is infusing it quite a bit with his own personal ideas of how politics should work and what China should stand for. He's not the only one to do that. Again, he has a whole host of people also in the propaganda department who are working with him, who are constructing his ideology for him, much like the White House has speechwriters and people behind the scenes to do that as well. So I think that's a much wiser way to view this. But ultimately, his views matter, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit later, because I know you have international affairs on your mind as well, and how Xi might compare to other certain kinds of leaders. He has certain priorities that he has already signaled. And it's ongoing guesswork for us as China scholars to try and figure out, what does that mean for the future of Chinese politics? Because he's made it very clear what his stance on Taiwan is, for instance, and that he views reuniting or uniting China as his main goal as a leader. And that means assuring stability around the borders, whether it's in Xinjiang or whether it's in Hong Kong, integrating spaces into the Chinese political system that are currently not part of it, like Taiwan. And so he cannot back down on having made that such a clear agenda point for him. And that has implications for international politics, I think.
Yeah. So, indeed, we'll dive back into international politics. So, still, he seems to stand out as a leader, and well, it might be hard to dive into that. But to what extent are there any rivals, maybe within the party? You briefly mentioned the factions, but so what is it that enabled him to come up like this leader that seems to stand out compared to his predecessors, like, for instance, Hu Jintao?
Yeah, I mean, the Communist Party has always had these internal rivalries, and so that's why the narrative of factions is so attractive, or maybe I shouldn't call it a narrative, but rather a theoretical framework, because scholars do use that framework in order to explain how politics work in China, and sometimes that can be useful. There are arguments that most people who are associated with Hu Jintao have been marginalized in order to make sure that Xi Jinping can do his form of politics. The reason I'm always a little bit hesitant is because ultimately all of these cadres have the same agenda, which is to keep the Communist Party the legitimate ruler of China and to assure China's ascent in the world and assure stability within China. I think that's something that all of them share. But they differ slightly on how that should work, how much of a role the market should play, for instance, how much the state should play a role, and so on. So I think Xi Jinping has switched off a lot of his rivals through his actions over the last 10 years and through consolidating power. But that doesn't mean that he has completely purged everyone. This is tricky because it's a lot of guesswork is involved because so much of the politics happens behind closed doors. And that's the nature of Leninist politics. So I don't know how much of you are aware of how Leninist politics work. The idea is that the party is governed by democratic centralism. So what should happen, ideally, is that within the party, as decisions get formed, anyone gets heard. Sometimes the party reaches out and gets collaboration from society or gets input from elsewhere. Nowadays, the Communist Party does that a lot through big data analysis and tries to make that all feedback into the decision-making process at different levels. And as the decisions reach up through the pyramid and arrive higher up in the hierarchy, the doors get more closed, but the discussion becomes more open, supposedly. So once we reach the top, the Politburo Central Standing Committee, then we have a discussion among equals, where she is simply the first among equals. And the idea is that they rule by consensus. You're not going to be able to push policy through among those men. It's all men, so sadly, at the moment. So all those men have to be minimally on board, and it's sort of a pulling straws, lifting hands situation where if anyone who has to implement one of those politics says, I can't do it, then they have to go back to scratch and start negotiating again. And that only works if you have people in the committee who are also have different viewpoints. Otherwise, it's not an effective way to govern. And it's called centralism because once the decision gets made, then it just has to be implemented. No one can deviate, which is why it looks so authoritarian, and it is. But there's a democratic element before it, supposedly, which doesn't work through elections and votes, but it works through some consultation. Sadly, that may not be as institutionalized and open anymore as it used to be under previous administrations, which were trying to do more with these consultation mechanisms than it seems Xi Jinping is doing at the moment. But yeah, I would say there are still, maybe not rivals, but dissenters in the party. It's 90 million people. It's the size of Germany. Not all of them are politicians, right? Not all of them do policy. But it's still thousands and thousands of people with very different views who contribute, and otherwise the system doesn't work.
So then that means that Xi is now up for his third term. That that decision has to have been made with at least some degree of support among the centralists.
Yeah. Having him do another term, it alienates a certain number of people in the party and in society as well, particularly the people who were much more strongly focused on what we might call constitutionalism. China, you wouldn't use that word, I suppose, because that's an evil word. But the idea that there should be a constitutionally regulated rule of law basis of society, and that you should have predictable mechanisms for how to govern and how to manage, for example, succession down the line.
And would every 10 years a new
every 10
person
years,
make sense?
Person. Exactly. That's exactly why that group of people was so upset when Xi Jinping abolished the term limit. So there was a lot of aggression also against among nationalists. No, there's a lot of nationalists were criticizing Xi online. So sometimes people think there's no criticism of the Communist Party online. That's not true. So a lot of people were very angry with Xi Jinping at the time. But for other groups in the Chinese Communist Party, it makes a lot of sense to move ahead with a strong leader like this, because there's this constant fear that the Chinese Communist Party is currently facing a serious crisis. The economy isn't as sound as maybe the leaders make it seem, with something like the trade war looming and still having its effects and maybe going on. That's going to be a real risk. COVID. There's so many factors that put the CCP's power on very fragile feet, that having a strong leader seems like a good solution to overcome this, consolidate power, solve these problems, and then maybe return to a different model of governance. I think that's probably what some of the CCP cadres were thinking when they were supporting this idea. Yeah. I'm not sure it came from Xi alone. It probably came from a whole cohort of people.
And that would also then entail that there isn't a proper second person in place.
No.
Because otherwise you would have been able to also appease the constitutionalists.
Yeah, precisely. So it is still very much an open question of who Xi would see as a valid successor at some point.
One of the things I was also wondering about, so we briefly talked about Xi's own views. It's maybe hard to put a finger on it, but in terms of ideology, it seems, well, there were a lot of things on your prezi. So to what extent is there a clear political ideology of, well, let's say the party in this case? And yeah.
Yeah, I do think that the party has a, I hesitate to say clear ideology because that's exactly where the rub is, but it has a ideology, right? is written into its own constitution. It is propagated through the propaganda department. There is a host of people who are constantly tweaking and calibrating it in order to make sure it fits the times. A lot of ideological work gets done. Having said that, the reason I'm hesitating about clear is because part of the power of ideology in the CCP's hands is that it's not always clear. It's frequently key terms that get floated almost like empty signifiers, as semiotics people would say, that can be filled with content by others. And so this is not just under Xi Jinping. So also under Hu Jintao, when the harmonious society concept got launched by the same people, by the way, who are also now doing Xi Jinping's propaganda and ideology work. It was absolutely unclear what that would mean. And then various people filled that concept with meaning, some with very conservative ideas. In Shanghai around that time, when I was doing research on this at the Shanghai Expo, the Shanghai authorities were actually interpreting harmony as harmony and diversity, and were making arguments that were very neoliberal, really, which was on the opposite end of the spectrum of how people in more conservative circles were understanding the term. And so often ideological work is a way to signal certain terms and key phrases and then invite people to fill them with meaning and then decide later on top-down which is the correct one, right, which is the one that we pick. And then flag them for people to use in politics. For those of you who speak Chinese or have some Chinese background, it's called Tifa, the standard set of Chinese Communist Party vocabulary that has the role of being sort of catchwords, watchwords, almost dog whistle kind of terms that you can use, and everyone kind of gets on board knowing, oh, okay, well, we're in this realm of politics right now because this word got flagged, or that certain agents can say, I'm just going to constantly repeat the phrases from the Belt and Road Initiative in order to get funding for my project. I'm going to write it into every kind of grant proposal and everything, and then, I'm legitimating myself in that way as being, loyal to this kind of set of concepts, even though I don't necessarily know what they mean. So ideology plays also that role, and so that's why I'm saying there may be a coherent ideology moving around in the background that keeps getting adjusted, but it's not always clear, and that's on purpose.
Right. So, so there is some kind of ideology, but so can we then also see maybe a shift? So, okay, there's this blend of Marxism, Confucianism, consumerism / capitalism to some extent. Can we see a change now in how, for instance, Hu Jintao approached it and how Xi is now going about it in his third term?
Well, I do think that in general under Xi, ideology has become more important again. And again, throughout PRC history, you have a sort of up and down, back and forth of how much emphasis gets placed on ideology. Deng Xiaoping was famously all about pragmatism, about using whatever worked. Didn't really matter whether the cat was white and black and so on. Whereas, ideology gets a little bit more dogmatic under Xi Jinping, and certainly also more dogmatic than it was under the previous administration. But I think it's quite telling how flexible the Communist Party still is with integrating different ideas into its own ideology, especially traditionalism. So we mentioned Confucianism earlier. The Communist Party is not the Confucian Party, right? It's still the Communist Party. And yet using these terms and ideas very, very selectively fulfills a certain, it fulfills a certain function for the Communist Party.
Could you give an example of that?
Well, harmony. It's not a good example because we're talking about Xi Jinping right now. But under Hu Jintao, that was the main... it's not much in use anymore under Xi Jinping, mainly because of him trying, I guess, to divorce himself from the previous administration. Right. But the general idea of trying to use the concept of harmony, which had vastly different meaning in the analects and in the traditional original writings, and say, well, what it really means is that, now I don't know the Dutch phrase with the grass halm that is too long and gets cut off. All grass has to be the same height.
Kop boven het gras uit.
That's the one. The nail sticks out, it gets hammered. Harmony meaning push towards uniformity and keeping your head down and doing what the Communist Party says. That is a misinterpretation of Confucian classics. That's not exactly what the originals meant, but it's convenient that it lends itself to that interpretation. You can do that. And Neo-Confucian or contemporary Neo-Confucians have indeed done that. So selectively picking these bits and pieces serves that purpose, I would say. I don't know, did I just answer your question?
An example of how, So, you did. So, one of the things that caught my attention was when we talk about, you mentioned the nationalists. They're also in the ideology part, but you said, well, we can see a nationalist spur in the wake of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Could you maybe elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, well, again, complicated because the situation is changing so rapidly. A couple of months ago, I think I'm still on the record in some journalistic context, having said that the Communist Party was very successful in selling its COVID policies to the public and generally very successful at managing the pandemic. Even though I don't necessarily approve of the exact policy measures, the communication was very effective. And I have loads of propaganda examples of people from society joining the propaganda effort with their own content on platforms like Bilibili, video sharing platforms, announcing how everyone should pull together, 中国加油, go China, that sort of rallying around the flag. So that seemed to have been very successful. I'm saying it's a little bit dated to say that now because the situation in Shanghai has just been so awful, absolutely horrible, that a lot of people are very dissatisfied in China. Right now. So I don't think the same narrative that worked for Wuhan works now. And it's not just Shanghai. There's a lot of places that are under lockdown where people are fed up and are suffering quite severely, so that the nationalist push, it might actually, there's a very real risk it might turn on the Communist Party. Because the nationalists, that's also something that people tend to misunderstand. The nationalists aren't always supportive of the leadership and of the party. Sometimes they are, but they also, there's not one nationalism. There's numerous different kinds of nationalisms, and they get in each other's hair. And I mentioned earlier the example of the term limits and how they got extended, and you had discussions, one of my colleagues looked at this, on how you have nationalists who are supportive of Xi and nationalists who aren't, and they really have a fight online with each other of what the nature of the nation and the state at this particular moment in history should be. And I think over COVID, we're seeing something quite similar. And also over Russia, with significant divides in the Chinese public sphere of who has what position.
And okay, so that might be a nice bridge to talk about Russia, indeed. So what is the struggle then about? On how China should position itself vis-à-vis Russia?
Yeah, whether or not Xi Jinping's support for Putin and allying himself so closely with Russia is a good idea or not, and whether Xi is wrong. So there's a whole bunch of, probably, so these are scholars from Stanford who study this. Probably about 50% of the people who comment on social media in China are pro-Putin, so about half. That leaves the other half, right? And so there's a whole lot of people who are nuanced about it and are skeptical about it. There's a small number of people, probably something around 10% or so, who are supportive of the Ukraine. And a lot of this becomes a proxy discussion, really, about China's role towards the quote-unquote West. I don't like using the word West because there's so much involved in that, but mainly people mean the US. And most of the people who are pro-Russia have a very strong anti-American sentiment, and they buy into the narrative that the Russian war in Ukraine is really the US's fault and NATO's fault. So that's kind of a very popular narrative in China, in those circles. And then you have other people who are defying a little bit the disinformation campaigns in that regard, or providing a little bit more nuance on the historical context. And so that's kind of one of the fragmenting points of ideology. But overall, the Communist Party is very much on board with the pro-Russian narrative and keeps seeding the internet with stories that are often very straight-up disinformation about what's really going on.
So how does that connect to, you mentioned earlier that China has faced a century of humiliation, or at least that's the narrative, and now it's our time, or China's time, to again shine in the sun in global politics.
Yeah.
How does it look? Does it look like? How does it look like, and how does it compare to? Does that explain the more pro-Russian attitude, maybe?
To some extent. And I'm simplifying massively, and we don't have enough time. No. But the situation, the relation with Russia is fraught also because, there's been war between China and Russia. There was a split in the Mao era between the Soviets and the Communist Party. So not everyone is a fan of Russia and Russian politics. But overall, the experience of standing as a defiant bulwark against American imperialism as a narrative, that's something that especially sort of the new left can relate to. and say, here's another strong man who's also in our shoes and who's being maligned. And then you get the exact same connection again to the alt-right, also in the US and in Europe, where the idea is, poor Putin. Yeah? This poor man is just being misunderstood and misrepresented by the evil liberals. And so that's something that also the new left can relate to, and why that narrative has traction in China. So I think that's where these various different perspectives come together to see Russia as the more reasonable ally. And then there's, of course, also the story of what a renegade province next door might mean for a large territorial country. So where Russia might view Ukraine or parts of Ukraine as technically Russian territory, which is why this is happening. Let's incorporate this back into the Great Russian Empire. That would be a very clear analogy for the Chinese Communist Party to say, there's this island across the straits and it's part of our territory, we need it back. And there's been an escalating discussion in China, moving from attempts to peacefully reunite. I shouldn't use reunite. Unite, because people in Taiwan will be very upset, suggesting that Taiwan was never part of mainland China and so on. So very, very landmines of political sensitivities talking about this. But the idea of unifying and integrating Taiwan into mainland politics used to be an effort that was supposed to be peaceful, work for economics, through closer political ties, supported by some folks in Taiwan as well, especially on the blue camp side, the conservatives, who felt for a long time that actually reunification would work the other way around. China would become more like Taiwan. And once that was possible and China was willing to become more democratic, why not reunite? We're all Chinese here. The green camp is the ones that very strongly disagree and feel that Taiwan is a completely different society. And so as much as the green camp, the liberal progressive side, has gotten more powerful in Taiwanese politics, and a younger generation has grown up with that perspective and that worldview, there just simply isn't all that much favor anymore for seeing Taiwan as part of China in Taiwan. And so that has frustrated the efforts on the mainland, with a lot of people there saying, well, maybe we just need to invade. Maybe military operation is the only way forward. And so a lot of us were very worried. Some of my colleagues in the UK were making this case that during the final end of the first, I hope last, but maybe first, Trump administration, there was a very real chance that the Chinese government would say, okay, so everything is so in disarray, particularly now that COVID has broken out, Trump can't handle it, this would be the right moment. Yeah. Right? And fortunately, no one acted on that, because that would have been a very serious misjudgment. But we now also see the Russian case, and the Chinese Communist Party leadership has been looking very closely at how that worked out. I'm kind of hoping that has put a dampener on the stories of military invasion, because it has worked out so poorly for Putin, and the economic sanctions in particular have been so devastating that the Chinese Communist Party has to ask itself what would happen if that had been us. And seeing as the urban elites I showed you earlier, the legitimacy basis among that group of the population is mainly assuring a modicum of wealth. That's also why the Shanghai lockdown is so devastating, because people are literally hungry in Shanghai, right? The fridges are empty. No one can go shopping. And having people hungry is exactly the opposite of what the Communist Party promised it was going to do. And so the thought that that boycotts might seriously damage the Chinese economy, that could be the end of the Communist Party. And I think the leadership knows that. And so maybe that is going to cause a reassessment of Taiwan. But I'm just guessing, right? And no one can predict the future.
No. But in terms of this grander foreign policy plan, would that entail breaking U.S. hegemony, or would it and working towards a more what you might call multipolar order, or would it also strive for Chinese supremacy? Sounds a bit.
I know what you mean. I think it's the first, the multipolar order, though some folks will disagree with me. The problem is that, again, there isn't a clear Chinese foreign policy. I have a colleague, Tim Rührich, who just wrote a book about this called, I think, Contradictions in Chinese Foreign Policy. Oxford University Press, worth checking out, or maybe it's Cambridge. It just came out, and he makes the case very eloquently that on numerous foreign policy issues, the party itself keeps having conflicting outcomes and conflicting politics, and that's because, for example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs tends to have a cosmopolitan liberal outlook, and when it's in charge of certain of processes, it ends up doing more cosmopolitan, multipolar politics. If the People's Liberation Army or a domestic ministry is in charge of some concern, then issues get nationalist much more quickly. And so it really depends on who is steering politics in a particular policy field. But I think overall, and also the Belt and Road Initiative kind of illustrates this, the goal is indeed to break up any kind of hegemony and make sure that the international world order isn't just dominated by the United States, so that China can also promote its interests. But I don't think the idea is to replace the United States as a hegemon. Some people will say I'm just being naive in that regard, but I do think that the Chinese Communist Party over and over reiterating this point and saying we're never going to be hegemonic, we have no interest in that, it's worth taking that seriously. Not because everyone in the party agrees, but because, again, we have different groups in the party, and there's certainly an audience for that kind of narrative and for that perspective. And so I think European and American and generally foreign leaders have an entryway to say, well, let's take you seriously on this, and let's work together and collaborate on that and empower the folks who are making these points, while maybe not empowering the people who are more hawkish and want the more aggressive policies.
Sure.